So Ford have released some technical specifications around a next generation Everest, and this video is a quick look at what they mean, particularly around towing and off-roading. So here's a recap of what we know. There are four models. There's the Ambiente, Trend, Sport and the Platinum, two engines, the 2-litre diesel and the 3-litre diesel, and of course, as with the Ranger and generally what car makers do, the better engine, the more powerful engine, only available in the two top models. All 10-speed automatics, the 6 is gone, there'll never be a manual. The 4x2 model, the two-wheel drive model, is still retained but in the lower trim levels, and there's a 50mm track increase, which is the distance between the centre of the front axle, front tyres here and here. A few more points. Ford are really crowing about this 3,500 kilogram towing capacity, so let's take a look and see if yet again their marketing people have got ahead of their engineers or not. We'll do that later in the presentation. It has a tow haul mode. How useful that's going to be, don't know. I've used it on other Ford vehicles. Basically that sort of sets the transmission up for shift point for towing, etc., but it was pretty smart and did that anyway. There is an integrated electric brake controller option as in the Ranger. It's not standard, that comes with the tow bar. The blind spot includes trailers, so the car's starting to be set up better for towing now, which is good. There is still the rear cross-axle locker, which is standard in the 4-wheel drive Everest. That's been carried over, and on the previous model it had brake traction control activated on the front axle when the rear locker was engaged. However, it was desensitized, wasn't very effective, and hopefully it will be a bit more, the front traction control will be more effective when the rear locker is on in the next generation. Ford say there are functional tow hooks, so that's potentially probably not rated recovery points. The previous generation, the Gen 1, did have rated recovery points front and rear, but that was never in the Ford specs. I just got told that directly by an engineer. 800mm wading at 7 kilometers an hour or less, so that's carryover from the previous one. And the specs do say that on base models there are 17-inch wheels, which is great news for off-roaders, and I presume that the brake calipers are the same all the way through the range. I'm hoping so, and therefore 17s will fit even on the top spec models. That's what we're hoping. Here's what the inside of the vehicle looks like. Major changes, obviously this huge sort of Tesla-like screen that we've got here. The shift is changed a bit, and electronic park brake. Steering wheel looks pretty much the same, and a TFT dash there as well. And for reference, that's a 2017 Trend. You can see the steering wheel is pretty similar. Normal park brake there, and one other thing I should say here, good use of buttons. Really happy to see that. The more buttons you've got in an off-roader, the better, because the problem with purely touchscreen is you're bouncing around and you touch something and it's not what you thought it was, and it doesn't operate with gloves or wet hands or whatever else there. So really good to see that there's some buttons still retained there. Okay, now let's talk about the drivetrain modes. Now this is where life starts to get interesting. With the previous model, it was an all-wheel drive vehicle. The only thing you could do is put it in low range, which is this button here, and that was it. And that button is to lock the cross-axle rear differential lock, and we'll talk about the terrain management system in a moment. So that was really the only button you had. Now they've got this. So this is in the 4-wheel drive models only. You can run it in 2-wheel drive. You can run it in what they term 4A or 4 automatic, 4 high, and then 4 low. And if you're thinking, hang on, this sounds familiar, yeah, you're probably right. Mitsubishi Super Select. Here's what it is. And interestingly, Jeep in the JL Wrangler for Australia have the same system, although they're really confused about it, and I'm not quite sure they know what to call it. But basically, it's the same system. So now you can run your Everest in 2-wheel drive. So why do you want to do that? The only reason I can think of is that you want to drift it, or if you want a fractional advantage in fuel economy, which I think will be pretty minimal, and then there's other disadvantages with that as well. Anyway, let's talk about these new modes. So the 2H mode, 2WD, that would be rear drive only. Wasn't available in the Everest, but is in the next gen. Now we've got 4A. Now this is where I'm going to speculate a bit. I'm pretty sure that would mean, well, we had that in the Everest, that was your all-wheel drive mode. Now the Everest Gen 1 and also the Gen 2 will have a centre clutch which automatically distributes torque front and rear. So you can't manually lock it, the computers do that for you based on what they detect the car is doing, and it's also influenced by the terrain mode that you've got it in. So I'm presuming in the next gen Everest that's going to be the case. Now the interesting thing here is the 4H mode, which wasn't in the Gen 1 Everest. So I think with 4H you might be able to lock that center diff, at least that is what I'm hoping here. And obviously with the Gen 1 you couldn't lock the center diff, it would lock its, or clutch really, it would just lock itself automatically. So I'm a bit hazy about the difference between those two. I might email Ford and ask them, but I'm not massively hopeful of a response to that sort of question. And then 4 low, with the Gen 1 Everest, that was 4-wheel drive low range. Again, the center clutch never manually locked. What happened was the computers again just decided how much lock there should be, but I'm hoping with this one it will actually lock completely. Now part of the reason I'm keen on this is because despite the fact manufacturers keep coming out with torque sensing center clutches for front and rear torque distribution, I've never found anything to be as good as a simple center differential lock. And also the Everest actually has a significant problem with parking downhill. If you basically park the vehicle, put the park brake on, put it in neutral and go to put it in park after you've secured it on the handbrake, then what you'll find is the car will actually unlock its center clutch, go down the hill, locking the rear wheels, and then it will lock the center clutch again, which applies brakes in effect to the front wheels. I've got a video on this, you can see it's not great, so hopefully they fix that, and I know that they know about it because I've been out in the bush and told them. So hopefully they'll fix that in the Gen 2. Now TMS, terrain management system. So this was the old vehicle. It had different terrain management modes. It had a normal, mud ruts, snow, sand, etc., and rock crawl. And here's a Land Rover, and you're looking, hang on, this looks very similar. Well, it does. Well, Ford used to own Land Rover, and obviously there was some form of technology sharing agreement, hence the icons. The same terrain management system versus Land Rover's terrain response, all very similar indeed, and that basically set the vehicle up for different terrains like your mud, your sand, your snow, etc. Pretty decent technology. Land Rover have done a really good job out of it. Okay, so these are the drive modes, which is what is in effect replacing TMS or the terrain management system, and you can see we've got a normal mode for driving around, eco, which no one really ever uses, tow haul, which probably slightly questioned the need for, and in the 4x2s that's about it, but you do have a slippery mode, and I think that's a good name for it rather than snow, because what would happen with snow was people would use the snow mode in deep snow and it wouldn't work and they'd wonder why. Calling it a slippery mode I think is much better, and that's all you get in the Ambiente 4x4. The other 4x4 vehicles get a mud ruts and a sand mode, which will be useful. The car will be optimized for that, but I wouldn't say it's probably absolutely essential. I think you could still get where you need to get to in Australia without those two modes. So let's talk about rooftop weights then, and on the previous model we had no less than 4 different weights, and this is from the owner's manual here, depending on the wheels of the car, oddly enough, whether it was a moonroof, various other things. With the next gen it looks like we've only got one weight to worry about, which is a dynamic load 100 kilograms, and well done Ford, one of the few manufacturers to publish a static roof limit, 350 kilograms, so that means you'd be okay to use a rooftop tent, which is great. Now remember that 100 kilogram limit, that includes the weight of the roof rack. So if you've got a 30 kilogram roof rack, that leaves you 70 kilograms of payload on the roof, but you also have still that 100 kilograms comes out of the vehicle's overall payload. I've got another video where I explain all of the roof loading mechanisms and calculations in great detail. Now ARB have teamed up with Ford to produce all of these accessories, which is great, so they're factory fit and warranted, etc., available at your dealer. Okay, so let's take a look at some specs then. We're going to compare a Gen 1 Trend 4x4, the popular model, against 3 of the Gen 2s, the base model 4x4 Ambiente, the 4x4 Trend, and the 4x4 3-litre Sport, which is one down from the top model. So the first thing you see is that the power has dropped by 3 kilowatts. You won't notice that from the driver's seat at all. It's going to be completely irrelevant, probably something to do with emissions. What you will notice if you get into the 3 litre is the extra 30 odd kilowatts there. That's definitely going to be something you'd appreciate. The carryover engine, the 2 litre, same 500 newton meters maximum torque, but you'll notice the extra 100 out of the 3 litre, that's for sure. Curb weight varies, 2417, the equivalent over here 2383, slightly lighter. I don't think Ford have done anything major in lightening the vehicle. vehicle, because otherwise they'd be sure to tell us all about it. That's probably just due to different trim levels and specification levels there. And there's a significant difference between the very light 4.2, which doesn't have the four-wheel drive drivetrain up at the front and doesn't have all the luxury features of the Sport, and the Platinum's even heavier again. Now the GVM previously was 3100. Now there's 3 different GVMs here, as I said before, depending on the weight of the vehicle. The payload, much of a muchness. Gen 1 had 383, slightly better with the Gen 2 due to the increased GVM and payload weight going down ever so slightly. But again, as often you find, the base models tend to do the best on the payload, as we're seeing here, because they tend to be lighter vehicles. GCM was previously 5900, and now, in one thing Ford have standardised, is 6250 GCM across the board, which is important for towing. We'll see that in a moment. Maximum tow 3100, and yes, 3500 towing for the Everest. Yes, Ford, this is what you want everyone to shout about. So here you go, I'm shouting about it, 3500 kilogram, but can it really do it? All right, so let's do some comparative towing specs. Now I'm going to use 3100 kilogram trailers, and the reason for that is that that's the maximum brake tow of the Generation 1 Everest, and we'll see how the Gen 2 and the Ranger gets on with that. I'm going to assume a 310 kilogram tow ball mass. Now I do not suggest that you always use 10%, which is what that is, but for comparative purposes and a nice round number, it's probably the maximum we'll use, then we will run with that. Now I'm going to calculate the payload at that given trailer weight for each of the vehicles. Now the interesting thing about that is that the calculation varies depending on which limit you hit first. Do you hit the GVM first or the GCM? And depending on the vehicle and the trailer, that can vary. You can also hit the rear axle load limit, but I'm not calculating that because I don't have the information for the next gen Everest. All right, so with the next gen Ranger, the GCM's is up from 6000 to 6350. We're putting that 3100 trailer on. The car weighs 2225. We've got a 715 kilogram payload, and in fact, because the GCM is so high, you've actually got all of the payload, a whole ton of it to use, and I've just subtracted the tow ball mass off that to come up with the 715 payload. With the Everest Gen 1, the GCM's a lot lower, 5900, and the car is heavier, 2407, so we've got correspondingly less payload there, and you tend to be GCM limited, so significantly less with the Gen 1 Everest. With the Gen 2, car weight slightly lighter than the Gen 1, but we've got a greater GCM, so therefore we have more payload available than the Gen 1. So what this means is that if you have a 3100 kilogram trailer to tow, you're better off towing it from a numbers perspective with the new Gen Everest because of the extra GCM than you are with the older one. So no great surprise there, and good to see Ford have increased that. By the way, these are the trend 2 litres. Everything will change slightly depending on whether it's a 4x2 or 4x4, which engine, etc. Okay, now Ford have also said, and this is to their credit, to comply with these limits, occupants or luggage may need to be restricted to not exceed the GCM and GVM limits, which is what I've been saying for years and years and years and years, which is great, but I haven't mentioned the axle load, and they really should. So a little bit more work to do there, Ford, but you know, good to see that bit is at least there. All right, now let's ramp it up to 3500 kilogram trailers. I'm going to throw the LC 300 in here, and with the next gen Ranger, we're taking 3500 off that. We're down to 625 kilograms on the payload because we've got, I'm assuming again, a maximum tow ball mass of 350. The LC 300 is down to 350 kilograms. Interestingly, the limit on that tends really not to be the GCM. It's got quite a high GCM for what it is. And the next gen Ranger is 367, which is actually a little bit more than the LC 300. However, that is GVM limited as opposed to GCM limited. So if you have less tow ball mass, you're going to be better off with the LC 300, but still pretty comparable. Not that I'd really recommend towing 3500 with any of these vehicles, but nevertheless, those are the stats if you wish to do it, and that comes back to Ford's warning. Okay, now let's take a look at 3 Everests, the 4x2 Ambiente, which is the cheapest and lightest, and the top end 4x4 V6 and the Trend in the middle, and they're all towing 3.5 ton trailers, and comes out with 391 kilogram payload for the Ambiente, 350 for the Trend, and only 258 for the Platinum. So why is that the case? Well, the short answer is the Platinum is the heaviest. It's got the heaviest drivetrain, it's got the 4x4 drivetrain, and it's got all sorts of luxury features which add weight. And despite the fact it's got a greater GVM than the Ambiente, that doesn't quite cancel it out. And also the GCM is the same across the 2 vehicles, and the Ambiente, even though it has the lightest, it was the lightest vehicle at 2259, quite significantly lighter than the Platinum, it does have a lower GVM, but the GCM and everything else is the same. So for maximum payload, if you want to be towing 3.5 tons, then this is the vehicle to do it. Alright, so let's summarise the new generation Everest then. So the first thing, it's better for heavy towing from a numbers perspective at least than the generation 1, and that's due to its increased GCM, and I assume increased tow mass. And I would also assume Ford's got new generations of suspension tune, electronic control, trailer stability control, etc. So it should be a better tow car. Now it is comparable to the other 3,500 kilogram wagons. Depending on whether you go LC300 or Everest, I think that would depend on exactly what your trailer is, but it's certainly up there. Not that I'd really recommend any of them for 3,500 kilogram towing. I do expect the car to be better off-road. One of the historic weak points of Ford off-road vehicles has been the brake traction control, and I'm desperately hoping they will have improved it in this version. I don't see things like the tyre diameter changing or the approach departure angles or anything else. There's no front locker, etc., or the rear locker is there, so it should be a bit better off-road. I don't know if it's up to Prado standards, but we'll have to see that. And I would expect there to be a whole bunch of improvements across the vehicle, which don't really come out on the spec sheets, and if they did, you can be sure that Ford would certainly have promoted that as well. And the new drive modes there, yeah, I think that would be nice to have extra drive modes, but a 2-wheel drive mode, really can't see a lot of point of that. Anyway, I hope you found this video useful. Thank you very much for watching. If you've got any questions, please drop them in the comments.